Atlacamani, the storm goddess. Picture yourself standing on the ancient shores of the Gulf of Mexico 500 years ago. The air is thick with salt and humidity, and the sky above you churns with an unnatural darkness. Fishermen hurry their canoes toward the safety of the beach, their faces etched with a terror that goes beyond mere weather. Women clutch their children close, and even the bravest warriors glance nervously toward the horizon where clouds pile upon themselves like mountains being born from nothing. Then you hear it, a sound like the breathing of something immense and alive, a low rumble that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The water before you begins to writhe and dance, responding to some invisible command, and massive waves start building far out at sea, marching steadily toward the land with murderous intent. The priest would tell you that what you are witnessing is not simply a storm. What you are watching is the awakening of a goddess. Her name is Atlacamani, and she has grown displeased with the world of mortals. Welcome to a journey into one of the most fascinating and mysterious corners of Aztec mythology, a voyage into the domain of a deity who embodied everything the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica feared and respected about the ocean and its tempests. Tonight, we will explore the legends, the lore, and the lasting significance of Atlacamani, the Aztec goddess of oceanic storms, hurricanes, and the wild, untamable power of the sea itself. But before we dive into the depths of her mythology, I want you to understand something crucial about the world she inhabited. The Aztec civilization was one of the most sophisticated and complex societies in the pre-Columbian Americas. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, making water not just important to them, but absolutely central to their entire way of life. They developed floating gardens called chinampas to grow their food. They built vast networks of canals and aqueducts. They understood, perhaps better than any other civilization of their time, that water was simultaneously the giver and taker of life. This understanding is crucial because it explains why the Aztecs developed such a rich and detailed mythology around water in all its forms. They had gods and goddesses for rain, for rivers, for lakes, for the ocean, and yes, for the storms that could transform peaceful waters into instruments of absolute destruction. Atlacamani sits at the heart of this aquatic mythology, representing something that terrified the Aztecs in ways that few other natural phenomena could match: the hurricane. Now, I know what you might be thinking. We hear about hurricanes on the news every year. We have satellites to track them and meteorologists to predict their paths. But try to imagine a world without any of that technology, a world where these massive storms appeared seemingly from nowhere, powered by forces completely beyond human understanding. Try to imagine watching the sky turn black in the middle of the day, feeling the wind increase from a gentle breeze to a howling monster in a matter of hours, watching the sea rise up and swallow entire villages while lightning splits the heavens and thunder shakes the earth itself. In that context, the idea of a storm goddess makes perfect sense. The Aztecs needed a way to understand these catastrophic events, a framework for making sense of the senseless destruction that hurricanes brought to their shores. And so they created Atlacamani, a deity who could explain the unexplainable and provide a focus for their prayers, their offerings, and their desperate hopes for survival. But Atlacamani was never a simple deity. She was complex, multifaceted, and deeply connected to the larger web of Aztec beliefs about the cosmos, the gods, and the place of humanity in the grand scheme of creation. Over the next several hours, we will unpack all of these connections, exploring not just who Atlacamani was, but why she mattered so profoundly to the people who worshipped her. We will examine her divine family, tracing her connections to some of the most powerful gods in the Aztec pantheon, including the mighty rain god Tlaloc and the beautiful water goddess Calcayatlicue. We will explore the extraordinary powers attributed to her, abilities that went far beyond simple weather control to encompass dominion over sea creatures, feminine beauty, and the very forces of life and death themselves. We will delve into the cosmic significance of her mythology, connecting her to the famous Aztec legend of the five suns and the cycles of creation and destruction that shaped their understanding of the universe. And perhaps most fascinatingly, we will discover how Atlacamani's story connects to similar goddesses from cultures around the world, revealing something profound about how human beings everywhere have struggled to make sense of the terrifying power of storms. From the Roman Tempestus to the Yoruba Oya to the Taino Huracan, we will see how different civilizations developed remarkably similar ways of personifying and worshiping the destructive forces of nature. By the time we finish this journey together, you will understand not just a single goddess, but an entire worldview, a complete system of beliefs that helped one of history's great civilizations make peace with the uncontrollable forces that surrounded them. You will gain insight into how mythology works, how it takes the incomprehensible and makes it comprehensible, how it transforms terror into reverence and helplessness into a sense of cosmic order. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that spans centuries, crosses oceans, and touches on some of the deepest questions human beings have ever asked about their relationship with nature. This is the story of Atlacamani, the storm goddess of the Aztecs, and it begins in a world where the boundary between the divine and the natural was not a boundary at all. To truly understand Atlacamani, we must first understand the world she inhabited, both the physical world of ancient Mexico and the spiritual world that the Aztecs constructed through their mythology. These two worlds were not separate in the Aztec mind. They were intimately intertwined, with every natural phenomenon having a spiritual explanation and every spiritual truth manifesting in the natural world. Let us begin with the geography. The Aztec Empire, which flourished from the 14th century until the Spanish conquest in 1521, was centered in the Valley of Mexico, a highland basin surrounded by mountains and volcanoes at an elevation of about 7,000 feet above sea level. At the heart of this valley lay a system of interconnected lakes, the largest of which was Lake Texcoco. It was on an island in this lake that the Aztecs built their capital city of Tenochtitlan, which at its height was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. This location had profound implications for Aztec culture and religion. Living on and around water meant that the Aztecs were constantly aware of its power and importance. They developed sophisticated systems for managing water resources, building causeways to connect their island city to the mainland, constructing aqueducts to bring fresh water from mountain springs, and creating the remarkable Chinampas, artificial islands made from layers of vegetation and mud that served as incredibly productive floating gardens. But water was not just a practical concern for the Aztecs. It was also a spiritual one. They believed that the universe was structured both horizontally and vertically, with the earth floating on primordial waters surrounded by the great ocean that encircled the world. Below the earth lay 9 levels of the underworld, and the journey to the realm of the dead began with crossing a dangerous river. Above the earth stretched 13 levels of heaven, with different gods inhabiting different celestial realms. In this cosmology, water was everywhere. It surrounded the earth, flowed through the underworld, and fell from the heavens. It was the substance from which life emerged and to which it returned. And because water was so fundamental to the structure of the cosmos, the gods who controlled water were among the most important deities in the entire Aztec pantheon. This brings us to the climate of the region, which powerfully shaped how the Aztecs understood and related to water. Central Mexico has a marked seasonal pattern, with a wet season typically running from May to October and a dry season from November to April. During the wet season, summer rains were crucial for growing the staple crops that sustained the Aztec population, particularly maize, beans, and squash. Without these rains, crops would fail and famine would follow. But too much rain could be equally devastating, causing floods that destroyed homes, drowned people and animals, and ruined the harvest just as thoroughly as drought. The Aztecs were keenly aware of this delicate balance. Archaeological evidence and historical records reveal that severe droughts occurred periodically throughout Aztec history, including devastating dry periods in the years around 1454 that caused widespread famine and suffering. Tree ring records suggest that prolonged drought may have contributed to the decline of earlier Mesoamerican civilizations, including the great city of Teotihuacan, whose ruins the Aztecs regarded with religious awe. But it was not just drought and flood that concerned the Aztecs. There were also the storms, particularly the hurricanes that swept in from the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. These massive tropical cyclones brought winds of unimaginable violence, torrential rains that could drop inches of water in a matter of hours, and storm surges that could inundate coastal areas with walls of seawater. The Aztecs had no way to predict when these storms would come or how severe they would be. They could only watch the sky for signs and pray to the gods for protection. This climatic reality explains why the Aztec pantheon included so many water-related deities. It was not redundancy. Each god controlled a different aspect of water and weather, and all of them needed to be appeased if the Aztec people were to survive and prosper. At the top of this aquatic hierarchy stood Tlaloc, the great rain god. Tlaloc was one of the oldest and most widely worshipped deities in Mesoamerica, with origins predating the Aztec civilization by centuries, perhaps millennia. He was depicted with distinctive goggle-like eyes and large fangs, often holding a lightning bolt or a staff. The Aztecs believed that Tlaloc controlled the rains that fell from the sky, and they dedicated one of the two great shrines atop their main temple in Tenochtitlan to his worship. The other shrine was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the war god, demonstrating that in Aztec thought, rain was as important as victory in battle. Tlaloc was served by a host of lesser rain spirits called the Tlalocs. These beings were often depicted as small, dwarf-like figures who lived in the mountains where clouds gathered. The Aztecs believed that the Tlalocs possessed 4 great jars filled with different types of water. When they broke one jar, gentle, beneficial rain would fall upon the crops. But they had other jars that brought harmful weather. One produced rain that caused crops to rot, another brought drought-inducing conditions, and the fourth unleashed destructive hail and freezing rain. The type of rain that fell depended on which jar the Tlalocs chose to break, and this choice could be influenced through proper worship and sacrifice. Alongside Tlaloc stood Calcayotlicu, whose name means she of the jade skirt. Calcayotlicu was the goddess of freshwater sources, lakes, rivers, streams, and springs. While Tlaloc controlled the rain that fell from the sky, Calcayotlicu ruled the water that collected on the Earth's surface. She was depicted as a beautiful young woman wearing an elaborate headdress with large tassels and a jade green skirt representing the waters under her domain. In Aztec art, she was often shown with streams of water flowing from beneath her skirt, symbolizing her role as the source of all earthly waters. The relationship between Tlaloc and Calcayotlicu varies in different sources. Some myths describe them as husband and wife, partners in controlling the water cycle. Others call them siblings, emphasizing their complementary but distinct roles. Still, other accounts suggest that they might be different aspects of the same divine water force, manifesting differently depending on context. This ambiguity was typical of Aztec religion, which embraced complexity and multiple interpretations rather than insisting on rigid definitions. These were not the only water deities, however. There was also Huixtocexochtl, the goddess of salt and salt water. The Aztecs considered her the elder sister of the rain gods, and one myth explained that she gained dominion over salt water after her younger brothers, the Tlalocs, grew angry at her mockery and banished her to the salt beds. It was there that she discovered how to create salt, becoming both the patron of salt makers and the personification of the ocean's saline nature. Her festival, celebrated during the 7th month of the Aztec calendar, involved 10 days of dancing and culminated in a human sacrifice, demonstrating how central she was to Aztec religious practice. And then there was Atlacamani. While Tlaloc controlled rain, Calcayatlicue ruled freshwater, and Huixtocexochtl personified the saltiness of the sea. Atlacamani represented something more specific and more terrifying: the oceanic storms that could devastate coastal communities and threaten anyone who ventured upon the waters. The Aztecs understood that ocean storms were different from ordinary rain. They knew that these tempests brought not just heavy rainfall, but howling winds, towering waves, and a destructive power that seemed almost personal in its malevolence. A regular rainstorm might soak your crops and flood your fields, but a hurricane could obliterate your entire village, drown your family, and leave nothing behind but churned up mud and shattered timber. This distinction was crucial because it meant that appeasing Tlaloc was not enough to protect against oceanic storms. You needed to placate a different deity, one whose nature was specifically attuned to the wild and violent character of hurricanes. This was the role that Atlacamani filled in the Aztec pantheon. The Aztec understanding of the ocean itself was complex and somewhat mysterious, given that most Aztecs lived far from the sea. The Nahuatl word for ocean was Iluicatl, which can be translated as sky water or celestial water. This term suggests that the Aztecs saw the ocean as fundamentally connected to the heavens, perhaps as a continuation of the celestial waters that they believed surrounded the earth. The firmament above was thought to be a great plate supported by divine forces, with celestial waters above it that might break through to cause rain. This cosmological understanding placed the ocean in a special category, neither purely terrestrial like lakes and rivers, nor purely celestial like rain. It was a liminal space, a boundary zone where different realms of the cosmos came together. This liminality may explain why the ocean and its storms required their own dedicated deity, rather than simply falling under the jurisdiction of Tlaloc or Calcayatlicue. The Aztecs also believed that the earth floated on primordial waters, surrounded by a vast ring ocean that encircled the world. This surrounding ocean was the ultimate boundary of existence, the edge beyond which nothing human could venture. What lay beyond the ring ocean was unknown and perhaps unknowable, a realm of mystery and danger that even the gods might not fully comprehend. Atlacamani's domain thus touched the very edges of the known cosmos. She ruled waters that bordered on the infinite, storms that came from regions beyond human experience. This cosmic positioning added to her power and her mystery. She was not merely a local deity who controlled a particular phenomenon. She was a goddess whose realm connected to the fundamental structure of the universe. The Aztec relationship with water was further complicated by their agricultural practices. While the Chinampas around Lake Texcoco made brilliant use of water resources, farming in most of the Aztec Empire depended heavily on rainfall. The summer monsoon rains were essential for growing maize, the staple crop that sustained the population. A good rainy season meant abundant harvests and prosperity. A poor rainy season meant hunger and possibly starvation. This dependence on rain created a natural focus on weather deities and weather prediction. The Aztecs developed sophisticated systems for observing and interpreting natural signs that might indicate coming weather patterns. The behavior of animals, the appearance of clouds, the timing of flower blooms, and many other natural phenomena were read as messages from the gods about what weather to expect. Priests who served the rain deities would have been expected to possess special expertise in interpreting these signs. The anxiety about adequate rainfall extended to the highest levels of Aztec society. The emperor himself was held partially responsible for ensuring good harvests, and a series of poor growing seasons might be interpreted as divine displeasure with the ruler. This created powerful incentives for maintaining the rituals and sacrifices that were believed to keep the water gods satisfied. The elaborate ceremonies dedicated to Tlaloc and other water deities were not just religious exercises. They were essential state functions that supported the political legitimacy of the ruling class. Her name itself offers clues to her nature. The word Atlacamani is derived from Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs. The prefix atl means water, appearing in countless Nahuatl words related to aquatic concepts. The full name has been interpreted in various ways, but one common translation is she who dwells in the water or she of the waters. Some scholars have also connected her name to other Nahuatl terms suggesting fire or heat combined with water, which would reference the intense energy and power of hurricanes. Understanding this linguistic background helps us see how the Aztecs categorized their world. They did not simply have gods in an undifferentiated sense. They had a sophisticated system of divine specialists, each responsible for particular aspects of reality. This allowed worshippers to direct their prayers and offerings to the most appropriate deity, maximizing the chances that their petitions would be heard and answered. The Aztec approach to the divine also emphasized duality and balance. Almost every god had positive and negative aspects, benevolent and destructive faces. This was especially true of water deities, who could give life through irrigation and rain or take it away through flood and drought. Atlacamani embodied this duality perhaps more than any other water goddess. She was associated with the life-giving aspects of the ocean, the fish and other sea creatures that provided food, and the waters that supported coastal communities. But she was also the bringer of hurricanes, the destroyer who could reduce flourishing villages to ruins in a single terrifying night. This dual nature was not seen as contradictory by the Aztecs. It simply reflected the reality of the natural world, where the same forces that sustained life could also extinguish it. To worship Atlacamani was not to worship destruction for its own sake. It was to acknowledge the full complexity of the natural world and to seek a relationship with the divine that encompassed both fear and gratitude, both supplication and praise. As we move deeper into our exploration of Atlacamani, keep this larger context in mind. She was not an isolated figure, but part of a vast and intricate web of divine relationships, each connection adding meaning and depth to her character. She was the daughter of powerful gods, the sister of other water deities, and a crucial player in the cosmic dramas that shaped the Aztec understanding of the universe. To know her is to know something essential about how the Aztecs saw their world and their place within it. Now that we understand the context in which Atlacamani emerged, let us turn our attention fully to this remarkable deity herself. Who was Atlacamani? What did she look like? What powers did the Aztecs attribute to her? And what did she mean to the people who worshipped her? The name Atlacamani immediately signals her domain. In Nahuatl, as we discussed, ATL means water. The full name has been translated in various ways. Some scholars render it as she who dwells in the water, emphasizing her oceanic nature. Others interpret it as carrying connotations of the tumultuous, storm-tossed waters over which she held dominion. Whatever the precise translation, the name clearly marks her as a water deity with a specific focus on the more violent and unpredictable aspects of the sea. But Atlacamani went by other names as well, each highlighting different facets of her complex character. She was sometimes called Atlatoni, which can be translated as water fire. This name captures something essential about hurricanes. They are phenomena that combine the liquid element of water with an almost fire-like intensity and destructive power. Anyone who has experienced a major hurricane knows that it generates a kind of terrible energy that goes beyond ordinary weather, an energy that the Aztecs recognized and encoded in this evocative name. Another name associated with Atlacamani was Atatotl, meaning sea foam. This designation shifts our focus from the storm's violence to its immediate physical manifestation. When hurricanes churn the ocean, they whip the surface into a frenzy of foam and spray. The sea seems to boil and seethe, losing its ordinary appearance and becoming something almost alien. By calling their storm goddess sea foam, the Aztecs acknowledged this transformation, recognizing that her presence literally changed the nature of the waters. Perhaps most intriguingly, some sources mention the name Mythology in connection with Atlacamani, which can be interpreted as agave sun. This name introduces an unexpected dimension to her character, connecting her to the agave plant from which the Aztecs produced pulque, an alcoholic beverage. The link between a storm goddess and an intoxicating drink might seem strange at first, but it makes sense when we consider the Aztec understanding of divine power. Both storms and intoxication represent states of altered reality, experiences that break through the ordinary boundaries of daily life. Both can be exhilarating and dangerous, pleasurable and destructive. By connecting Atlacamani to the agave sun, the Aztecs may have been recognizing her as a goddess of intensity and transformation, of experiences that overwhelm normal consciousness. Visual depictions of Atlacamani present her as a powerful and beautiful figure whose appearance reflects her tumultuous nature. While artistic representations vary, a common image portrays her as a youthful woman with dark skin and eyes that resemble swirling storm clouds, eyes that seem to contain depths of darkness and flashes of lightning within their gaze. Her hair is described as long, dark, and wild, flowing down her back like cascading waterfalls or whipping about her face like the winds she commands. There is nothing serene or placid about her appearance. She looks like a storm made flesh, beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, awe-inspiring rather than merely pretty. The ornaments and clothing attributed to Atlacamani further emphasize her oceanic nature. Some depictions show her wearing turquoise jewels, stones whose blue-green color reflects the tropical seas and whose occasional flashes of brightness suggest lightning playing across stormy skies. Other representations describe her as bedecked in coral and shells, treasures from the depths of the ocean that symbolize her dominion over all that lives beneath the waves. These ornaments also hint at the dual nature of her power. Coral and shells represent the hidden life of the sea, the creatures that flourish in the waters she rules. But they also serve as reminders that the sea takes as well as gives, that countless sailors and fishermen have been claimed by the waves and now lie decorated with the same shells and corals that adorn their goddess. Atlacamani's domain extended far beyond simple weather control. While she was primarily known as the goddess of oceanic storms, her powers encompassed a much broader range of abilities that made her one of the most formidable deities in the Aztec pantheon. First and foremost, Atlacamani possessed the power to summon and direct hurricanes. The Aztecs believed that these devastating storms were not random natural events, but deliberate manifestations of divine will. When a hurricane struck the coast, it was because Atlacamani had chosen to unleash it, whether in anger at human transgressions, in response to proper worship and sacrifice, or for reasons known only to the gods themselves. This meant that hurricanes were never truly unpredictable. They might be mysterious, but they were not random. There was an intelligence behind them, a divine personality that could potentially be appeased or at least understood. Beyond hurricanes, Atlacamani controlled storm surges and the tremendous waves that accompanied major tempests. The Aztecs who lived along the coast knew the terror of watching the sea rise up and march inland, swallowing everything in its path. These storm surges could penetrate far beyond normal high tide lines, turning solid ground into seabed and submerging villages that had considered themselves safe from the water. Atlacamani was the force behind these surges, the goddess who commanded the ocean to overflow its boundaries and reclaim the land. But her power did not stop at the surface of the sea. Atlacamani was believed to have authority over the creatures that lived within the ocean depths. She could beckon sharks and whales, compelling even these mighty predators to follow her commands. Fish obeyed her will, swimming where she directed them and offering themselves up to the nets of fishermen she favored. In this aspect, Atlacamani was not merely a goddess of destruction, but also a potential source of abundance. A fisherman who earned her favor might find his catches multiplying beyond all expectation. One who angered her might find the seas mysteriously empty, the fish having fled to deeper waters at their mistress's command. The power of Atlacamani's voice was particularly feared. The Aztecs believed that she could speak with the full force of the ocean's roar, a voice capable of shaking the foundations of the earth itself. When the wind howled during a hurricane, they heard the goddess screaming her fury. When thunder crashed over the sea, they recognized her battle cry. And when the earth trembled, as it sometimes did during the most violent storms, they knew that her voice had reached down to the very bedrock of the world. Her utterances had practical effects as well. Atlacamani could call up currents with a single word, generating the powerful flows of water that could sweep boats off course or dash them against rocks. She could summon waterspouts, those whirling columns of water that rise from the sea to meet the clouds, bridges between her oceanic domain and the sky above. And her whisper could create the treacherous undertows that dragged unsuspecting swimmers to their deaths, silent killers operating beneath the seemingly calm surface of the water. Perhaps surprisingly, Atlacamani was also connected to concepts of feminine sexuality and beauty. Her wild energy and untamed power were seen as reflections of feminine potency in its most primal form. The Aztecs recognized a connection between the creative and destructive forces of nature and the creative and destructive potentials of human sexuality. Atlacamani embodied this connection, representing a kind of fierce feminine energy that was simultaneously alluring and terrifying. This association with feminine power had practical implications for her worship. Women might pray to Atlacamani not only for protection from storms, but also for the wild energy she represented, seeking to embody something of her fierce independence and formidable strength. The goddess was not a gentle mother figure, but a force of nature in the most literal sense, and some women sought to channel that force in their own lives. It is important to understand that Atlacamani was not simply a destructive deity. Like all Aztec gods, she had both beneficial and harmful aspects. The same storms that devastated coastal communities also brought rain to inland areas, replenishing water supplies and nourishing crops. The same waves that capsized fishing boats also churned up nutrients from the deep, sustaining the marine ecosystems that provided food for human populations. Even her most violent manifestations served purposes in the cosmic order, clearing away what needed to be destroyed and making space for new growth. The Aztecs understood this duality and incorporated it into their worship. They did not try to stop Atlacamani's storms. recognizing that such cosmic forces could not be prevented by human action. Instead, they sought to maintain a proper relationship with the goddess, honoring her power while asking for her mercy. The goal was not to control the uncontrollable, but to find a place of relative safety within the divine order, to position oneself as a faithful worshiper rather than a target for divine wrath. One intriguing aspect of Atlacamani's mythology is her possible relationship to Calcayatlicue. Some sources suggest that Atlacamani might not have been a separate goddess at all, but rather an aspect or manifestation of the greater water goddess. Just as Calcayatlicue ruled freshwater in general, Atlacamani might have represented her oceanic, stormy face, the aspect of water goddess that emerged when calm rivers and peaceful lakes transformed into raging seas and devastating floods. This interpretation fits well with broader Aztec religious concepts, which often featured gods who could manifest in multiple forms. A single deity might appear differently depending on time, place, and circumstance, with each appearance constituting a distinct divine personality while remaining fundamentally connected to the original god. If Atlacamani was indeed an aspect of Calcayatlicue, this would explain both the differences between them, with one calm and one violent, and their obvious connections as water goddesses with overlapping domains. Whether viewed as a separate deity or an aspect of Calcayatlicue, Atlacamani represented something essential in the Aztec understanding of the world. She was the acknowledgement that nature contains forces beyond human control, powers that can nurture and destroy with equal ease. She was the recognition that the sea, for all its gifts of fish and beauty and transportation, remains ultimately alien to human beings, a realm where we are always visitors and never masters. And she was the embodiment of the primal energy that pulses through the natural world, the wild current that storms and earthquakes and other catastrophes release into human awareness. In worshipping Atlacamani, the Aztecs were not worshipping destruction for its own sake. They were worshipping the totality of existence, including its most frightening aspects. They were admitting that human beings are small creatures in a vast and dangerous cosmos, that safety and prosperity are gifts that can be revoked at any moment, that the proper response to this reality is not denial but reverent acknowledgement. Atlacamani taught them to respect the sea, to fear the storm, and to recognize that both respect and fear were appropriate responses to the world as it actually is. No god or goddess in the Aztec pantheon existed in isolation. Each deity was connected to others through complex webs of family relationships, cosmic associations, and mythological narratives. To understand Atlacamani fully, we must explore her divine family, particularly her connections to two of the most important water deities, Tlaloc, the rain god, and Calcayatlicue, the goddess of fresh water. Let us begin with Tlaloc, for he stands at the very center of Aztec water worship. Tlaloc was ancient when the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico. Archaeological evidence suggests that rain gods with similar characteristics were worshipped in Mesoamerica for thousands of years before the rise of the Aztec Empire. The Olmec civilization, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, may have had their own version of this deity, and he appeared in various forms among the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, and many other cultures. By the time the Aztecs rose to power, Tlaloc was one of the most widely recognized and deeply revered gods in the entire region. The Aztecs depicted Tlaloc with a distinctive and immediately recognizable appearance. His most notable features were large, goggle-like eyes formed by the bodies of two serpents meeting over his nose, creating rings around his eyes that gave him an almost mask-like appearance. From his mouth emerged huge fangs, sometimes accompanied by a long tongue that descended over his chin. He was typically shown with blue or turquoise skin, reflecting his association with water and the sky, and he often wore an elaborate headdress featuring white hair and feathers. These physical characteristics encoded important symbolic meanings. The serpent imagery connected Tlaloc to the widespread Mesoamerican association between snakes and water. Just as snakes move through the landscape in undulating, wave-like patterns, water flowed in similar ways across the earth. The serpents around Tlaloc's eyes thus identified him as a water deity, while also suggesting the sinuous movements of rivers and the coiling patterns of rain falling from the sky. Tlaloc's power was immense and multifaceted. As the Lord of Rain, he controlled the precipitation that fell from the heavens, determining whether crops would flourish or wither. He held the lightning in his hands and could hurl it at the earth to strike down anyone who displeased him. He commanded thunder, which the Aztecs heard as the crashing of the great jars in which Tlaloc's servants stored different types of rain. And he ruled over a paradise called Tlalocan, a verdant realm of eternal spring where those who died by drowning, lightning strike, or water-related diseases spent their afterlives in bliss. The Aztecs showed their reverence for Tlaloc by dedicating one of the two great shrines atop the Templo Mayor, their main pyramid in Tenochtitlan, to his worship. This placement, alongside the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, the war god, demonstrated that rain was considered as important as military victory for the survival and prosperity of the empire. The high priest who served Tlaloc held a title and rank equal to that of the war god's high priest, a clear indication of the rain god's supreme importance. But Tlaloc was not only revered, he was also feared. The same god who sent gentle rains to nourish crops could also unleash devastating floods and deadly hailstorms. He could withhold the rain entirely, bringing drought and famine. He could strike down individuals with his lightning or claim them through the diseases associated with his power, including dropsy, leprosy, and rheumatism. Those who died in such ways were not cremated like ordinary Aztecs, but buried, their bodies painted blue and interred with seeds planted on their faces, dedicated to Tlaloc's realm. Most disturbingly to modern sensibilities, Tlaloc was propitiated through the sacrifice of children. The Aztecs believed that children's tears resembled raindrops and that their crying was a favorable omen indicating imminent rainfall. During festivals dedicated to Tlaloc, children were selected for sacrifice, often the second-born children of noble families or young captives taken in war. They were richly dressed in the style of the rain god and his attendants, then carried in procession to mountaintop shrines where priests would cut out their hearts. If the children cried during the journey, this was considered especially auspicious, as their tears would surely bring the rains. This practice horrifies modern observers, and rightfully so. But within the Aztec worldview, it made a terrible kind of sense. The gods required nourishment, and human life was the most precious offering that could be given. Without these sacrifices, the rains would fail, crops would wither, and the entire population would starve. The death of a few children, however tragic, was preferable to the death of everyone. This was the bargain that the Aztecs believed they had struck with their gods, a covenant written in blood that sustained the very existence of the world. Tlaloc did not control the waters alone. Working alongside him was Atlacamani, whose name means she of the jade skirt. While the exact nature of their relationship varies in different sources, she was most commonly described as either Tlaloc's wife or his sister. Together, they formed a divine pair that governed different aspects of the water cycle, with Tlaloc ruling the rain that fell from the sky and Atlacamani controlling the lakes, rivers, and streams where that rain collected on the earth. Atlacamani was depicted very differently from her fierce husband. Where Tlaloc appeared monstrous and terrifying, she was shown as a beautiful young woman, the the personification of youth and vitality. She wore an elaborate headdress consisting of multiple cotton bands wound about her head, bordered by rows of balls with large tassels hanging from either side. Her skirt was jade green, the color of the precious stone that shared its name with her, and in many representations, water flowed from beneath this skirt, symbolizing her role as the source of earthly waters. The personality attributed to Atlacamani was similarly complex. She could be gentle and nurturing, bringing fertility to the land and protecting women in childbirth. But she could also be vengeful and destructive when angered, withholding water to cause drought or sending floods to devastate the disobedient. In the Aztec creation myth of the five suns, she played a particularly dramatic role, ultimately destroying an entire world through her tears. This brings us to a crucial point about Atlacamani that has implications for understanding Atlacamani. In the myth of the five suns, Atlacamani served as the fourth sun, ruling over an age called Unveiled, or for water. Her reign lasted for hundreds of years, during which time maize was first introduced, and the world was characterized by abundant fish and water. But eventually, tragedy struck. According to some versions of the myth, the gods Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl became jealous of Atlacamani and struck her down from the sky. According to other versions, Tezcatlipoca accused her of being insincere in her love for humanity. Whatever the cause, Atlacamani was overcome with grief and began to cry. Being a water goddess, her tears were not ordinary tears, but cosmic deluges. She wept for 52 years, and her tears flooded the entire world. Some versions say her tears turned to blood, giving the flood an even more terrifying character. The people of that age were transformed into fish to survive in the rising waters. The heavens themselves collapsed, requiring the gods Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl to become great trees to hold them up until the flood receded. This myth reveals several important things about Aztec water goddesses. First, it shows that even the most beautiful and apparently gentle water deity carried within her the potential for absolute destruction. Atlacamani's tears ended an entire world. Second, it demonstrates the emotional depth attributed to these goddesses. Atlacamani was not a cold force of nature, but a being capable of profound grief, and her grief had cosmic consequences. Third, it establishes a precedent for water goddesses causing catastrophic events, a precedent that Atlacamani as a storm goddess would naturally embody. Now we come to the crucial question of Atlacamani's place within this divine family. Different sources offer different genealogies, reflecting the complexity and variation that characterized Aztec religious thought. However, the most common account describes Atlacamani as the daughter of both Tlaloc and Calcayatlicue, making her the offspring of the two most powerful water deities in the pantheon. This parentage explains much about Atlacamani's nature. From her father Tlaloc, she inherited mastery over the dramatic aspects of weather: storms, lightning, thunder, and the violent precipitation associated with hurricanes. From her mother Calcayatlicue, she received dominion over the waters themselves, the ability to command the ocean and its creatures. The combination of these inheritances made her perfectly suited to rule over oceanic storms, which combined both atmospheric violence and aquatic power. But some sources offer alternative genealogies that are equally revealing. One tradition suggests that Atlacamani's mother was not Calcayatlicue but Huixtocehotl, the goddess of salt and fire. If this were true, it would add new dimensions to Atlacamani's character. Huixtocehotl represented not just salt water, but also the destructive, purifying power of fire. A daughter combining Tlaloc's storms with Huixtocehotl's salt and fire would be a goddess of extraordinary intensity, embodying the violent energy that hurricanes unleash. It is also possible that these seemingly contradictory genealogies reflect different regional or historical traditions within the broader Aztec religious complex. The Aztec Empire encompassed many different peoples, each with their own local traditions and divine interpretations. A goddess like Atlacamani might have been understood differently in coastal communities, where hurricanes were a direct threat, versus inland cities, where such storms were known mainly by reputation. Different genealogies might represent different ways of incorporating this storm goddess into existing religious frameworks. Another possibility, which we touched on earlier, is that Atlacamani was not a truly separate deity, but rather an aspect or manifestation of Calcayatlicu herself. Just as a single person can be gentle in some circumstances and violent in others, Calcayatlicu might have had multiple faces that she showed to worshippers depending on context. Her calm, freshwater aspect would dominate when dealing with rivers and lakes. Her stormy, oceanic aspect, Atlacamani, would emerge when hurricanes threatened. This interpretation fits well with known Aztec religious patterns. Many Aztec gods had multiple aspects or forms, sometimes with different names, that represented different manifestations of the same divine power. If Atlacamani was indeed an aspect of Calcayatlicu, it would explain both their obvious differences and their fundamental similarities as water goddesses. The relationship between Atlacamani and the Tlalocs, the rain spirit servants of Tlaloc, also deserves consideration. These dwarf-like beings were responsible for actually dispensing the different types of rain from their mountain homes. If Atlacamani was Tlaloc's daughter, she would presumably have authority over these servants, commanding them to release the devastating precipitation associated with hurricanes. The Tlalocs might even have feared her, since her storms far exceeded their normal rain-making activities in both scale and intensity. Understanding Atlacamani's divine family helps us appreciate why she was both feared and respected. She was not some minor deity who could be safely ignored. She was the child of two of the most powerful gods in the entire pantheon, heir to the combined authority of rain and water. To disrespect her was to disrespect her parents, and the consequences of angering Tlaloc or Calcayatlicu were too terrible to contemplate. At the same time, her family connections meant that proper worship of the major water deities would presumably extend some protection from her wrath, maintaining the family bonds that linked all these gods together. Having explored Atlacamani's identity and family connections, let us now examine her powers in greater detail. What could this storm goddess actually do, according to Aztec belief? And how did her abilities compare to those of other powerful deities? The primary and most obvious power of Atlacamani was her control over oceanic storms. When a hurricane formed over the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean, the Aztecs understood this as Atlacamani asserting her will. She called the storm into being, shaped its fury, and directed its path toward whatever target she chose. Nothing about the hurricane was random or mechanical. It was all an expression of divine intention. Modern meteorology teaches us that hurricanes form when warm, moist air over tropical oceans rises and is replaced by cooler air, creating a cycle of rising and falling that eventually develops into a rotating storm system. But the Aztecs knew nothing of pressure systems and water vapor. They saw a hurricane as a living force, an extension of a goddess who was herself alive and purposeful. When the barometric pressure dropped and the winds began to howl, they were not witnessing physics. They were witnessing theology. Atlacamani's storms were not generic weather events, but personalized manifestations of divine power. Each hurricane might have its own character, its own level of intensity, its own specific targets. One storm might devastate fishing villages while leaving agricultural areas unharmed. Another might bring exactly the amount of rain needed for a good harvest, despite its terrifying appearance. Still another might seem almost playful, spinning harmlessly offshore before dissipating into the void. All of these variations reflected Atlacamani's mood, her intentions, and her response to the devotion, or lack thereof, shown by her worshippers. Beyond the storms themselves, Atlacamani commanded the waves. We have already mentioned her ability to raise storm surges, those walls of water that march inland during major hurricanes. But her power over waves extended far beyond these extreme events. She could make the sea swell with slow, deep rollers that would capsize boats miles from any visible storm. She could create treacherous cross-currents where different wave patterns intersected, turning normally calm waters into chaotic confusion. She could even generate rogue waves, those mysterious giants that appear from nowhere to swamp ships and then vanish without explanation. For the Aztecs who lived along the coasts or depended on maritime trade, this power over waves was literally a matter of life and death. Every time a fishing boat pushed off from shore, its crew was entering Atlacamani's domain. Their survival depended entirely on her favor. If she chose to raise the waves, there was nothing they could do. If she chose to calm them, they might return home safely with full nets. This radical dependence on divine will bred both deep reverence and deep anxiety, emotions that permeated coastal life. Atlacamani's power over marine creatures added another dimension to her authority. The Aztecs believed she could communicate with sharks, whales, dolphins, fish of all kinds, and the countless other animals that inhabited her oceanic realm. With a gesture or a word, she could summon them to her presence or send them on missions to carry out her will. This gave her tremendous leverage over coastal communities, for whom fish were a crucial protein source. A fisherman who had pleased Atlacamani might find his nets overflowing with catch. Schools of fish would seem to leap into his boat, and even dangerous predators like sharks would steer clear of his hull. But a fisherman who had angered the goddess would find the sea mysteriously empty. Fish would flee at his approach, and the creatures that remained would be the dangerous ones, circling his boat with obvious menace. In extreme cases, Atlacamani might send marine predators directly against those who had offended her, turning sharks and other dangerous animals into agents of divine retribution. There are hints in the mythology that Atlacamani's power extended to other marine phenomena beyond storms and creatures. She may have controlled the tides, the rhythmic rising and falling of the sea that the Aztecs would have observed but could not explain. She may have been associated with undersea earthquakes and the tsunamis they generated, events that would have seemed like storms rising from the ocean floor rather than falling from the sky. And she may have held authority over the mysterious deep, the abyssal regions of the ocean that no human had ever seen, but which clearly existed beneath the waves. The Aztecs believed the earth floated on primordial waters, surrounded by a great ring ocean that encircled the world. Atlacamani's domain encompassed this entire aquatic foundation of reality. She was not just a storm goddess, but a goddess of oceanic existence in all its forms. Anything that happened in or on the sea fell within her purview, from the tiniest fish to the mightiest tempest, from the gentle lap of waves on a peaceful shore to the earth-shattering roar of a full hurricane at landfall. Another aspect of Atlacamani's power concerned her voice. We touched on this earlier, but it deserves further exploration. The Aztecs attributed tremendous significance to divine speech, believing that the words of gods had creative and destructive force. When Atlacamani spoke, the world listened. Her voice could roar like thunder, howl like hurricane winds, or crash like massive waves breaking on rocky shores. But it could also whisper, murmur, and sigh, producing the subtler sounds of water in its gentler moods. The power of this voice went beyond mere volume or intimidation. Atlacamani could apparently speak the waters into motion, commanding currents to form and waves to rise through verbal utterance alone. This parallels broader Aztec beliefs about divine speech as a creative force, similar to the concept found in many other religious traditions. Just as some gods had sung or spoken the world into existence, Atlacamani could speak storms into existence, her words becoming weather, her sentences becoming swells. Her connection to feminine sexuality and beauty, though perhaps surprising in a storm goddess, represented another form of power. The Aztecs recognized that certain kinds of power were specifically feminine, including the power to attract, to allure, and to inspire both desire and fear. Atlacamani embodied a wild, untamed version of this power, the feminine force that cannot be controlled or contained. Her beauty was not the domesticated beauty of a goddess like Xochiquetzal, who represented cultivated flowers and gentle pleasures. It was the fierce beauty of a hurricane, terrible and magnificent in equal measure. This connection to feminine power had practical implications for worship and prayer. Women seeking to embody or channel Atlacamani's fierce independence might invoke her aid. Her wild energy was seen as available to those who approached her properly, offering a source of strength for women who felt constrained by social expectations. At the same time, men who sought to understand or relate to powerful women might also have cause to honor Atlacamani, recognizing her as the divine archetype of feminine force. It is worth comparing Atlacamani's powers to those of her divine parents to appreciate how she represented something new and distinct. Tlaloc, her father, controlled rain, storms, and lightning over the land. His power was crucial for agriculture and affected everyone who depended on farming, which meant virtually the entire population. But Tlaloc's domain was primarily atmospheric. He ruled the sky and what fell from it, not the depths of the sea. Calcayatlicue, her mother, controlled freshwater bodies, lakes, rivers, and streams. Her power was essential for drinking water, irrigation, and transportation along water routes. But Calcayatlicue's domain was primarily terrestrial, focused on the waters that flowed across and collected upon the land. The vast ocean was not really her concern. Atlacamani occupied the space between and beyond these parental domains. She ruled where sea met sky, where atmospheric storms combined with oceanic power to create the most devastating natural phenomena known to the Aztec world. Neither Tlaloc nor Calcayatlicue individually covered this territory. It required a new deity, one who inherited and combined their powers while also transcending them. This pattern of divine combination producing new deities was common in Aztec theology. The gods were understood to interact, influence each other, and sometimes produce offspring whose natures synthesized parental characteristics. Atlacamani was a perfect example of this generative process, a deity who made sense within the existing divine family structure while addressing a specific religious need that her parents could not individually meet. The comparison also highlights something important about Aztec theology: its flexibility and responsiveness to real-world conditions. The people who lived along the coasts needed a deity who understood their specific concerns, who knew what it meant to face hurricanes and depend on the sea for sustenance. They needed a goddess who was specifically their own, even if she was related to the more universally worshipped Tlaloc and Calcayatlicue. Atlacamani filled this need perfectly, providing coastal communities with a divine patron who truly comprehended the maritime way of life. The story of Atlacamani cannot be fully understood without placing her within the grand narrative of Aztec cosmology, particularly the myth of the five suns. This creation myth, one of the most important in all of Aztec religion, describes how the world has been created and destroyed multiple times, with each cycle featuring its own sun, its own kind of humans, and its own catastrophic ending. Water plays a crucial role in this myth, and understanding this role illuminates the cosmic significance of goddesses like Atlacamani. According to Aztec belief, the universe did not begin with a single creation but emerged through multiple attempts by the gods to produce a stable, functioning world. Each attempt resulted in a period of existence characterized by a particular sun, but each of these solar ages eventually ended in disaster. The current era, the fifth sun, is simply the latest in this sequence and is itself destined to end when the conditions for the next great catastrophe are met. The story begins before anything existed except Mythology, the supreme divine being who embodied both male and female principles. Mythology produced 4 sons who would become the great creator gods: Tezcatlipoca, associated with the north and the color black; Quetzalcoatl, associated with the east and the color white; Huitzilopochtli, associated with the south and the color blue; and Xiphotep, associated with the west and the color red. These 4 brothers, despite their filial relationship, were often in conflict, and their struggles would shape the cycles of creation and destruction. The first attempt at creation produced the son of the jaguar, with Tezcatlipoca serving as the sun. During this era, giants inhabited the earth and lived on acorns. But conflict between the creator gods led to disaster. Quetzalcoatl struck Tezcatlipoca from the sky, and the enraged god responded by sending jaguars to devour all the giants. This first world ended in carnage, consumed by the feline avatars of the displaced sun. The second creation produced the son of wind, with Quetzalcoatl as the sun. Ordinary-sized humans lived during this era, eating piñon nuts. But Tezcatlipoca sought revenge for his earlier humiliation. He caused Quetzalcoatl to be knocked from the sky, and in his fury, Quetzalcoatl sent hurricane winds that destroyed the world and transformed its people into monkeys. The third creation produced the son of rain, with Tlaloc, the rain god, serving as the sun. This is where we see the direct involvement of Atlacamani's father in the cosmic drama. Tlaloc ruled over a world whose people ate aquatic seeds and lived in relative peace. But then Tezcatlipoca, still continuing his pattern of disruption, stole Tlaloc's first wife, the beautiful goddess Xochiquetzal. Grief-stricken and enraged, Tlaloc refused to send rain despite the desperate pleas of the people below. Droughts swept the land, and when Tlaloc finally released precipitation, it came not as life-giving water but as rain of fire, burning away the third world and all its inhabitants. Only birds survived this conflagration, escaping into the sky. The fourth creation produced the son of water, and here we encounter the most direct ancestor myth to Atlacamani's domain. The son of this era was Calcayatlicue, the water goddess who may have been Atlacamani's mother. During her reign, maize was first introduced, and the world was characterized by abundant fish and water. This era lasted for 676 years, a relatively long period of stability. But even this prosperous age could not endure forever. According to some versions of the myth, Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl became jealous of Calcayatlicue's success and struck her down from her position as the sun. According to other versions, Tezcatlipoca accused the water goddess of being insincere in her love for humanity, claiming that her apparent benevolence was merely a performance. Whatever the cause, the accusation broke Calcayatlicue's heart. The water goddess began to weep. As a divine being whose very essence was water, her tears were not ordinary tears, but cosmic torrents. She cried for 52 years, the length of one full Aztec calendar cycle, and her tears filled the world with water. The flood rose inexorably, covering the land, drowning the mountains, reaching even to the heavens. To survive this deluge, the people of the Fourth Age were transformed into fish, taking on the forms of the creatures that could live in the world their goddess had created through her grief. The flood was so severe that it threatened the very structure of the cosmos. The heavens, unable to withstand the pressure of the rising waters, began to collapse. To save what remained of creation, the gods Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl transformed themselves into enormous trees, holding up the sky until the waters finally receded. Their sacrifice saved the cosmos but could not restore the fourth world, which had been forever transformed by Calcayutlac's tears. This myth has profound implications for understanding Atlacamani. First, it demonstrates that water goddesses in Aztec thought were capable of world-ending destruction. Calcayutlacu, despite being a deity of freshwater rather than storms, destroyed an entire creation through the power of her tears. If Atlacamani was her daughter, she inherited this capacity for catastrophic destruction. If Atlacamani was an aspect of Calcayutlacu herself, then she was the very embodiment of this destructive potential, the face that the water goddess showed when she was moved to destroy. Second, the myth establishes water as the instrument of world-ending catastrophe. The Fourth Age did not end in fire like the third, or in animal attack like the first, or in wind like the second. It ended in flood, in the overwhelming power of water unleashed without limit. For people who lived on coastlines threatened by hurricanes and storm surges, this must have been deeply resonant. They had seen, in miniature, what the myth described on cosmic scale. They knew what water could do when it turned against humanity. Third, the myth connects water catastrophe to emotional states. Calcayutlacu's flood was not a random natural event, but the product of grief, a goddess weeping because her feelings had been hurt. This emotional dimension persisted in understanding of water deities generally. Atlacamani's storms were not mechanical phenomena, but expressions of a divine personality, responses to the situations and stimuli that affected her mood. A hurricane might be anger, grief, or simply the wild exuberance of a goddess expressing her nature. After the Fourth Age ended in flood, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan, the great city whose ruins the Aztecs regarded with religious awe, to create a fifth world. But they faced a problem. There was no sun. The world lay in darkness, and without light, nothing could live. Someone would have to sacrifice themselves, hurling their body into a divine bonfire to become the new sun. A wealthy, proud god named Tecusistecatl volunteered first, but when the moment came to leap into the flames, his courage failed him. He approached the fire 4 times, and 4 times he drew back in terror. Then a humble, sickly god named Nanahuatzin stepped forward. Despite his poverty and his illness, Nanahuatzin threw himself into the fire without hesitation. Shamed by this display of courage, Tecusistecatl finally followed. 2 suns rose in the east, making the world too bright. To solve this problem, one of the gods threw a rabbit into Tecusistecattl's face, dimming his light and transforming him into the moon. But Nanahuatzin, now the 5th sun, still would not move. He demanded blood, the life force of the other gods, as payment for his sacrifice. Only when the gods agreed to regularly sacrifice themselves to him did the 5th sun finally begin its journey across the sky. This is the world in which we now live, according to Aztec belief. It is a world sustained by sacrifice, by the ongoing gift of life energy to the sun that makes existence possible. And it is a world that will eventually end, not in water this time, but in earthquakes. The 5th sun is known as the sun of movement, and its destruction will come through seismic catastrophe that shatters the earth itself. But until that final destruction comes, the water deities remain active and powerful. Tlaloc still sends rain. Calcayutlacu still governs freshwater. Huixtosahotl still rules the salt seas, and Atlacamani still commands the oceanic storms. Their actions can cause tremendous suffering on human scales, even if they do not rise to the level of world-ending catastrophe. A hurricane that wipes out a coastal village is, for the people of that village, the end of their world, even if the cosmos continues. Understanding the myth of the five suns also helps us understand why the Aztecs engaged in human sacrifice. They believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create and sustain the world, and that humans owed a debt of blood in return. The sacrifices to Tlaloc, including the sacrifice of children whose tears were thought to bring rain, were part of this cosmic accounting. The offerings made to propitiate Atlacamani would have followed similar logic, giving life energy to the goddess so that she might be satisfied and refrain from sending devastating storms. The cyclical nature of Aztec time also colored how they understood storm goddesses like Atlacamani. The Aztecs did not see time as a linear progression from past to future, but as a series of cycles that repeated with variations. What had happened before would happen again, in some form. The Great Flood of the Fourth Age was not just a past event, but a model for what water could do. A reminder that the water deities were always capable of repeating Calcayatlic's tears on whatever scale they chose. This cyclical view made every hurricane a potential echo of that primordial flood. When Atlacamani sent her storms against the coast, she was reenacting, in miniature, the catastrophe that had ended an entire world. The fishermen fleeing her waves were fleeing the same force that had once transformed humanity into fish. The villages swept away by storm surges were experiencing the same fate that had befallen the entire Fourth Age. Past and present were not separated by an unbridgeable gulf, but connected through the ongoing activity of deities who had existed since the beginning and would continue to exist until the final earthquake destroyed everything. The Aztec understanding of cosmic time also included the concept of the calendar round, a 52-year cycle created by the interlocking of the 260-day ritual calendar and the 365-day solar calendar. At the end of each calendar round, the Aztecs celebrated the new fire ceremony, a ritual that marked the renewal of time and the continuation of the world. During this ceremony, all fires throughout the empire were extinguished. People waited in darkness and fear, uncertain whether the sun would rise again or whether the world would end. When the Pleiades star cluster reached its zenith at midnight, priests sacrificed a victim and used a fire drill on his chest to kindle a new flame. If the fire caught, it was a sign that the world would continue for another 52 years. The new fire was carried to temples throughout the empire, and from there to every household, reigniting the hearths that sustained daily life. The darkness was transformed into light, and the anxiety of potential cosmic destruction gave way to the relief of continued existence. This ceremony reflected the Aztec understanding that the world's continuation was not guaranteed, but depended on divine favor and human ritual action. The sun would not simply rise on its own. It needed to be fed, propitiated, and supported through proper worship. If humans failed in their duties, the gods might allow the current world to end, as they had allowed previous worlds to end. This sense of cosmic precariousness colored how the Aztecs understood all natural phenomena, including storms. Every hurricane was a reminder that the gods had destroyed worlds before and could do so again. Every survival was a gift, not a right, dependent on the maintenance of proper relationships between humans and deities. The storms that Atlacamani sent were not merely weather events, but messages, warnings, tests, or punishments that had to be interpreted within this larger framework of cosmic vulnerability. The myth of the five suns also established certain forms of death as sacred transitions rather than mere endings. Those who died by drowning, lightning strike, or water-related diseases did not go to the ordinary afterlife of Mictlan, but to Tlalocan, the paradise of the rain god. This special treatment reflected the belief that such deaths were chosen by the water deities, that the victims had been selected for a particular afterlife rather than simply killed by misfortune. For people who lived with the constant threat of hurricanes, this doctrine provided some comfort. If a loved one was swept away by storm surge or drowned in the turbulent waters of a hurricane, at least they had gone to paradise rather than the gloomy underworld. Their death was not meaningless, but part of a divine plan that included a blessed afterlife. This did not eliminate grief, of course, but it provided a framework within which grief could be processed and meaning could be found. The concept of Tlalocan deserves further exploration, as it reveals important aspects of how the Aztecs related to their water deities. This realm was described as a place of eternal spring, where flowers bloomed perpetually and food was always abundant. It was located in the mountains where rain clouds gathered, suggesting a connection between the atmospheric source of rain and the destination of those claimed by water. The dead who went there did not face the arduous journey through the 9 levels of Mictlan, but instead entered directly into a realm of peace and plenty. Children who died young were also believed to go to a special afterlife, sometimes identified with Tlalocan or with a separate paradise where they would be nurtured until they could return to the world in a future existence. This belief helped parents cope with the tragically common occurrence of child death in pre-modern societies, where infant and childhood mortality rates were far higher than today. The children sacrificed to Tlaloc were understood to be going directly to this blessed realm, which may have provided some consolation to families who offered their offspring to the rain god. The water deities were thus associated not only with the living, but also with specific forms of death and afterlife. Atlacamani, as a storm goddess who ruled phenomena that killed people through drowning and other water-related causes, would have shared in this association. Those who died in her storms were joining the realm of her divine family, becoming part of the community of souls who served the water gods in their mountain paradise. Now let us explore how the Aztecs actually worshipped Atlacamani and the other water deities, examining the rituals, ceremonies, and offerings that they believed could maintain positive relationships with these powerful gods. Understanding these practices helps us see how the abstract mythology translated into lived religious experience. The Aztec religious calendar was extraordinarily complex, featuring multiple interlocking cycles that determined when different festivals and ceremonies would take place. The most important cycles were the 260-day ritual calendar, called the Tanalpwali, and the 365-day solar calendar, called the Xiapowali. Every day was associated with specific deities and had particular religious significances, and approximately 1/3 of the days in the Aztec year involved festivals or ceremonies honoring the water gods. For Tlaloc, the rain god, major ceremonies occurred during several months of the year. The festival of Atlacamani, celebrated from mid-February to early March, was dedicated to Tlaloc and the Tlalocs. This was a crucial time in the agricultural calendar, as the dry season was nearing its end and the rains needed to return if crops were to grow. During Atlacamani, children were sacrificed on sacred mountaintops, their tears seen as omens of the coming rains. 7 children were typically sacrificed in and around Lake Texcoco each year during this festival. The festival of Tozas Tontli, from late March to mid-April, also honored the water deities and involved additional child sacrifices. The victims were taken to caves in the mountains where the water gods were believed to dwell, and after their hearts were removed, their bodies were left in these sacred spaces. The caves represented the sources of water, the places from which springs and rivers emerged, and leaving sacrificial victims there was thought to nourish the underground sources of the life-giving fluid. Another major festival was Atlacamani, celebrated in the 6th month of the Aztec year. During this period, rain priests would ceremonially bathe in lakes, imitating the movements and calls of waterfowl. They used special rattles called Atlacamani, fog rattles, that were believed to summon rain. The priest's mimicry of water birds was sympathetic magic, an attempt to encourage rain by acting out behaviors associated with aquatic environments. Atlacamani, the freshwater goddess, was honored alongside Tlaloc in many of these ceremonies. She had her own specific festival day, the Day 5 Serpent, and presided over the Trecina, 13-day period, of one reed. During ceremonies dedicated to her, priests would dive into lakes and perform rituals intended to please the goddess and ensure the continued flow of fresh water. Young girls might be sacrificed to Atlacamani in Lake Texcoco at the same time that young boys were sacrificed to Tlaloc on the mountaintops, balancing the offerings between the complementary water deities. Huixtosahotl, the salt goddess, had her own major festival during Tecuahuatantli, the 7th month. This festival lasted 10 days and featured dancing by salt makers, particularly women associated with the salt trade. The dancers arranged themselves in rows and sang in high, trembling voices that were said to ring like bells. The culmination of the festival involved the sacrifice of a woman who had been chosen to embody the goddess, the Exipla, or divine impersonator. Priests used the sharp snout of a swordfish to cut into her flesh before removing her heart as an offering. While the specific rituals dedicated exclusively to Atlacamani are not as well documented as those for these other water deities, we can reasonably infer some aspects of her worship from what we know about Aztec religion generally and storm-related religious practices specifically. First, Atlacamani would certainly have received offerings from coastal communities, particularly those engaged in fishing and maritime trade. These offerings likely included items associated with the sea, shells, coral, fish, and perhaps the valuable goods that came through oceanic trade routes. Precious materials like jade and turquoise, whose colors reflected the sea, would have been particularly appropriate gifts for a goddess whose domain was the ocean. Second, prayers to Atlacamani would have intensified when hurricanes were approaching. The Aztecs could observe the sky and recognize the signs of incoming storms, darkening clouds, changing wind patterns, and the behavior of animals sensitive to atmospheric changes. When these signs appeared, communities in the storm's path would have desperately invoked whatever deities they thought might help. Atlacamani, as the goddess who commanded such storms, would have been the primary focus of these emergency supplications. Third, human sacrifice may have been part of Atlacamani's worship, either as regular offerings or as emergency measures during particularly severe storm seasons. The pattern of sacrificing to water deities was well established, and a goddess who controlled hurricanes would have warranted similar propitiation. Victims might have been drowned rather than having their hearts removed, since drowning was the form of death most closely associated with water deities and would have been seen as appropriate for a goddess of the sea. Fourth, the fishermen and sailors who entered Atlacamani's domain would have developed their own personal rituals and observances. Before setting out on the water, they likely made small offerings to the storm goddess, asking for her favor or at least her indifference. These offerings might have been cast into the sea, returning to the goddess some portion of what her domain had provided. The practice of making such offerings before dangerous activities was common across Aztec culture, and the dangers of the sea would have motivated particularly fervent devotion. The psychology of worshiping a destructive deity like Atlacamani is worth considering. How did the Aztecs maintain a relationship with a goddess whose primary manifestation was devastating storms? The answer lies in the Aztec understanding of divine nature as fundamentally dual. Every god had beneficial and harmful aspects, and the same deity who caused suffering could also prevent it or provide blessings. Atlacamani, for all her terrifying power, was also the guardian of the ocean's riches. The fish that fed coastal communities, the shells and coral that served as currency and decoration, the very waters that made maritime trade possible were all under her authority. A fisherman could not reject Atlacamani's storms without also rejecting Atlacamani's fish. A merchant could not refuse to honor the storm goddess while still accepting the profits that came from ocean-going trade. The relationship was total. If you lived by the sea, you lived with Atlacamani in all her aspects. This total relationship created a kind of intimacy between worshippers and their terrifying goddess. They did not simply fear her. They depended on her, worked within her domain, ate the creatures she commanded, and built their lives around the rhythms she imposed. When a storm came, it was not an alien invasion, but a manifestation of a deity with whom they had an ongoing relationship. The terror was real, but it was terror of someone they knew rather than terror of a faceless, meaningless force. The temples and shrines dedicated to water deities were among the most important religious sites in the Aztec Empire. The Templo Mayor, the great temple at the heart of Tenochtitlan, featured two shrines atop its massive pyramid, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun, and one dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god. The placement of these two shrines side by side demonstrated that the Aztecs considered rain as important as warfare for the survival and prosperity of their civilization. The Tlaloc shrine was painted in white and blue, colors associated with water and the sky. Inside, priests maintained eternal flames and performed daily rituals to honor the rain god. The high priest of this shrine bore a title equal in rank to the high priest of Huitzilopochtli's shrine, reflecting the importance of water worship in Aztec religious hierarchy. Archaeological excavations of the Templo Mayor have revealed numerous offerings associated with water deities, including shells, coral, marine creatures, and jade objects whose green-blue color represented the precious waters the Aztecs so desperately needed. Beyond the central temple, shrines to water deities were found throughout the Aztec world. Mountaintops were particularly sacred to Tlaloc and the Tlalocs, as the Aztecs believed that clouds gathered around mountain peaks before releasing their rain. The most important of these mountaintop shrines was located atop Cerro Tlaloc, a 4,000-meter peak on the eastern edge of the Valley of Mexico. Aztec rulers would make annual pilgrimages to this site to perform rituals asking for rain and celebrating the changing seasons. The shrine atop Cerro Tlaloc contained 5 stones representing Tlaloc and his 4 cardinal direction manifestations, the Tlalocs who stood at the corners of the universe holding up the sky. There was also a structure that housed a statue of Tlaloc along with idols representing sacred mountains from various regions, emphasizing the connection between mountains, water, and divine power. Sacrifices conducted at this high-altitude shrine were believed to be particularly effective at ensuring the arrival of the rainy season. Caves held special significance for water worship as well. The Aztecs believed that caves were entrances to the underworld and sources of underground water. Spring water that emerged from caves was considered especially sacred, having originated in the realm of the water deities. Ceremonies conducted in caves were thought to communicate directly with the gods who controlled these subterranean water sources. For coastal communities, the relationship with water deities was even more immediate and pressing. While we lack detailed documentation of shrine sites dedicated specifically to Atlacamani, it is reasonable to infer that coastal peoples maintained local sacred spaces where they could honor the storm goddess and ask for her protection. These might have been located near the shore, perhaps on promontories overlooking the ocean or near coves where fishing boats were launched. Such sites would have served as gathering places for the rituals and offerings that preceded dangerous maritime activities. The timing of water-related ceremonies followed both the agricultural calendar and the observable patterns of weather. The beginning of the rainy season, typically in May, was marked by intensive ritual activity. The end of the rainy season in October brought different ceremonies focused on thanking the gods for the precipitation that had sustained the year's crops. The hurricane season, which roughly corresponds to the period from June through November, would have been a time of heightened anxiety and intensified worship for coastal communities, who knew that any day might bring the devastating storms over which Atlacamani held dominion. The role of priests in water worship cannot be overstated. Aztec priests were full-time religious professionals who dedicated their lives to serving specific deities. They underwent extensive training in ritual procedures, mythology, astronomical observations, and the interpretation of divine signs. Priests of water deities would have been experts in recognizing weather patterns and reading the signs that indicated whether the gods were pleased or displeased. Their judgments about when to plant crops, when to avoid the ocean, and when to conduct ceremonies would have been authoritative for their communities. These priests lived austere lives, maintaining ritual purity through fasting, self-sacrifice, and abstinence from worldly pleasures. They pierced their ears, tongues, and other body parts with maguey thorns, offering their blood to nourish the gods. This self-sacrifice paralleled and complemented the human sacrifices they conducted, creating a continuous flow of life energy from the human world to the divine realm. Without this flow, the Aztecs believed, the gods would weaken and the cosmic order would collapse. The concept of reciprocity was central to Aztec religious practice. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and to set the fifth sun in motion. Humans owed a debt that could only be repaid through corresponding sacrifice. When people offered blood, whether their own or that of sacrificial victims, they were maintaining the fundamental exchange that kept the universe functioning. This was not worship in the sense of mere praise or thanksgiving. It was active participation in cosmic maintenance, work that was as essential to the continuation of the world as farming or warfare. This reciprocal understanding shaped how the Aztecs related to all their gods, including storm deities like Atlacamani. She had power over forces that could destroy human communities, but she was also part of a system in which humans had a role to play. Through proper worship and sacrifice, humans could maintain their side of the cosmic bargain, giving the gods reason to show favor rather than wrath. A hurricane that struck a faithfully worshiping community might be understood as a divine test or a mystery beyond human comprehension. A hurricane that struck a community that had neglected its religious duties was clearly punishment for that neglect. This approach to frightening natural phenomena was psychologically sophisticated in ways that modern people sometimes fail to appreciate. By personifying hurricanes as the actions of a goddess, the Aztecs transformed random natural disasters into meaningful events within a comprehensible cosmic order. A hurricane was not just bad luck. It was a communication from the divine, a message that could potentially be understood and responded to. This gave even the most devastating storm a kind of sense, a place within a larger framework of meaning. The alternative, which is closer to the modern scientific view, is to see hurricanes as purely physical phenomena without intention or meaning. This is certainly more accurate in terms of meteorology, but it offers less psychological comfort. When a hurricane destroys your home under the scientific worldview, it is simply something that happened, a result of atmospheric conditions that neither knew nor cared about your existence. This may be true, but it is also profoundly alienating. The Aztec approach, by contrast, maintained connection even in disaster. Atlacamani might be terrifying, but she was a terrifying person rather than a terrifying nothing. She could be addressed, offered to, pleaded with, and potentially appeased. Even if your pleas went unanswered and your village was destroyed, you had at least been participating in a relationship rather than simply being crushed by indifferent physics. This is not to romanticize Aztec religion or to suggest that human sacrifice was anything other than horrifying. The point is simply that the Aztec approach to natural disasters, including the creation of storm goddesses like Atlacamani, served important psychological and social functions that we should understand before dismissing it as mere superstition. They were doing their best to maintain sanity and meaning in a world where devastating natural forces could strike at any time without warning. Atlacamani was not unique. Cultures around the world have developed deities who embody the power of storms, and comparing these various storm gods and goddesses reveals something profound about how human beings everywhere have struggled to understand and relate to the destructive forces of nature. In this section, we will explore storm deities from several different cultures, noting both their similarities to Atlacamani and their distinctive characteristics. Let us begin in the same region where Atlacamani held sway, the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico. Long before the Aztecs dominated central Mexico, the Taino people inhabited the islands of the Greater Antilles, including present-day Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. They too faced the terror of hurricanes, and they too developed divine explanations for these devastating storms. The Taino storm deity was called Jurakan or Hurakan, and his name is the source of our modern word hurricane. According to Taino mythology, the goddess Atabey created the earth and sky, and from her were born two sons, Ukaju, who created the sun, moon, plants, and animals, and Guacar, who became filled with jealousy over his brother's creations. Guacar began to destroy what Ukaju had made, using powerful winds to tear apart the earth. He took the name Jurakan and became the god of destruction, wind, and storms. The Taino people greatly feared Jurakan's wrath. His hurricanes battered their islands, destroying villages and taking lives. They performed rituals to appease him, hoping to ward off the next disaster. When Spanish explorers arrived in the late 15th century, they encountered not only these devastating storms, but also the indigenous stories explaining them. The word huracan entered Spanish and eventually English, carrying with it echoes of Taino theology. The similarities between Jurakan and Atlacamani are striking. Both were deities specifically associated with the violent tropical cyclones that swept through their respective regions. Both were feared for their destructive power, yet worshipped in hopes of gaining their favor. Both existed within pantheons that included other divine figures responsible for different aspects of nature. The parallel development of such similar deities in neighboring cultures suggests that the psychological need to personify and relate to hurricanes may be deeply rooted in human nature. Moving to the Maya civilization, which flourished in the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, and surrounding areas, we find another storm deity with a familiar name, Huracan or Hunrakan. Like his Taino counterpart, Huracan was associated with violent storms and destructive winds. But the Maya version of this deity had additional dimensions that reveal the complexity of Mesoamerican religious thought. For the Quiché Maya of Guatemala, Huracan was one of the creator gods who participated in making the world and humanity. He was called the Heart of Sky and was associated with wind, storm, and fire. In the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, Huracan plays a crucial role in the creation narrative, helping to form the earth and the first humans. He also caused the Great Flood that destroyed the second generation of humans when they failed to properly honor the gods. This creative aspect of Huracan distinguishes him somewhat from Atlacamani, who was primarily characterized as a storm goddess rather than a creator deity. But both figures embody the dual nature of divine power, the capacity to both create and destroy. Huracan helped make the world, but also unmade a flawed version of it. Atlacamani ruled a domain that was both life-giving, as the source of fish and the medium of trade, and life-taking, as the realm of hurricanes and drowning. Across the Atlantic, in West Africa, we find Oya, the Yoruba goddess of storms, wind, and transformation. Oya is one of the most powerful deities in the Yoruba pantheon, associated with the Niger River as well as with violent weather phenomena. She controls winds, tornadoes, and the storms that sweep across the African landscape. She is also associated with death and rebirth, serving as the guardian of the gateway between the worlds of the living and the dead. Oya's character shares important features with Atlacamani. Both are female deities who control violent natural forces typically associated with masculine power. Both are feared for their destructive capabilities while also being honored for their protective functions. Both represent the fierce aspect of feminine divine power, embodying an energy that is simultaneously nurturing and terrifying. And both exist within complex religious systems that include many other deities with complementary and sometimes overlapping domains. The worship of Oya spread to the Americas through the African diaspora, particularly the slave trade that brought millions of Africans to the Caribbean and Latin America. In the syncretic religions that developed in these regions, including Candomblé in Brazil and Santeria in Cuba, Oya was preserved and adapted to new contexts. Her association with storms made her particularly relevant in hurricane-prone areas, where her worship continues to this day. In ancient Rome, the personification of storms was Tempestus, whose name literally means storm or tempest. Unlike the more fully developed deities we have discussed, Tempestus was sometimes treated as a goddess and sometimes simply as a personified natural force. Roman sailors and travelers who faced stormy weather might pray to Tempestus for deliverance, and at least one temple was dedicated to her worship. The Roman general Scipio built a temple to Tempestus after surviving a severe storm off the coast of Corsica, fulfilling a vow he had made while asking for divine protection. The Romans also had other deities associated with storms and violent weather. Jupiter, the king of the gods, was the master of thunder and lightning, hurling his thunderbolts at those who displeased him. Neptune ruled the seas and could stir up storms to shipwreck those who traveled without his blessing. These gods were far more powerful and important than Tempestus, but she represented the specific phenomenon of storms in a way that the more general deities did not. In ancient Greece, from which Rome derived much of its mythology, storms were the province of multiple deities. Poseidon, god of the sea, could raise tempests with his trident and was greatly feared by sailors and coastal peoples. Zeus, the sky father, controlled lightning and thunder, sending storms to punish the wicked or simply to demonstrate his power. And then there were the Cenomanes, 3 monstrous giants each with 50 heads and 100 hands, who were said to cause hurricanes and other devastating storms. Their father Uranus feared their power and imprisoned them in Tartarus, but Zeus released them to help in his war against the Titans, and they were later assigned to release punishing storms at the command of the gods. Moving to Japan, we encounter Susanoo, the tempestuous god of storms and the sea. Susanoo was the brother of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and his relationship with his sister was marked by conflict and chaos. His destructive behavior in heaven led to his exile to the earth, where he eventually became a hero who slew an 8-headed dragon and saved a princess. But his stormy, unpredictable nature remained central to his character. Susanoo shares several characteristics with Atlacamani. Both are deities whose domains include the ocean and its storms. Both are capable of tremendous destruction, but are not simply evil. Both exist within family relationships that shape their divine identities, with Susanu as Amaterasu's troublesome brother and Atlacamani as the daughter of Tlaloc and Calcayatlicue. And both represent a kind of divine energy that is wild, powerful, and not entirely subject to control, even by other gods. In Hindu mythology, we find Vayu, the god of wind, and Rudra, an ancient storm deity who represents the destructive aspects of divine power. Rudra was eventually absorbed into the worship of Shiva, becoming one of that great god's many faces. But in earlier texts, Rudra was a terrifying figure who brought disease, death, and destruction through storms and other violent natural phenomena. He was propitiated with prayers asking him to turn his destructive power away from the worshipper and toward the worshipper's enemies. The Norse tradition offers us several storm-related figures, including Thor, whose thunder marked the passage of storms across the sky, and Jord, a god of the sea and of seamanship who controlled the winds that sailors depended upon. While Thor is better known today, thanks to his prominence in popular culture, Jord was crucial for the maritime Norse communities who depended on favorable winds for trade, fishing, and exploration. Sailors would invoke Jord before setting out, asking for the winds they needed and protection from the storms they feared. Even in traditions without specific storm deities, we find divine beings associated with the chaos and power that storms represent. In Chinese mythology, the dragon is associated with storms, rain, and water in all its forms. Chinese dragons were generally benevolent, bringing the rains that farmers needed, but they could also be destructive when angered. The dragon kings who ruled the four seas were powerful beings whose favor was essential for anyone who depended on maritime activities. In Native American traditions across North America, thunder beings and storm spirits appear in many different forms. The thunderbird, a massive supernatural bird whose wing beats caused thunder and whose eyes flashed lightning, was venerated and feared by numerous cultures. The Lakota people spoke of Wakinyan, the thunder being, who brought storms but also purified the world through the power of his tempests. These beings share with Atlacamani the characteristic of being simultaneously dangerous and necessary, feared and honored. The persistence of storm deities across so many cultures, across such vast distances, across millennia of human history, tells us something important about the human condition. We are creatures who need to make sense of our world, who cannot simply accept meaningless suffering and random destruction. When a storm devastates our homes, kills our loved ones, and upends our lives, we need to understand why. We need to believe that there is some reason, some purpose, some meaning to the chaos. Storm deities provide this meaning. They transform random natural events into purposeful divine actions. A hurricane is no longer just a weather phenomenon. It is the action of a goddess, a being with intentions, a personality that can be understood, addressed, and potentially influenced. This transformation does not make the storm less dangerous, but it makes it less absurd. It provides a framework for response, worship, sacrifice, prayer, repentance. It creates the possibility of relationship between humans and the forces that threaten them. Modern science has given us a different framework for understanding storms. We know about air pressure, ocean temperatures, the Coriolis effect, and the other physical factors that produce hurricanes. This knowledge has tremendous practical value, allowing us to predict storms and prepare for their arrival. But it does not address the psychological and spiritual needs that storm deities once served. It does not tell us why we are suffering or what we should do with our fear and grief. It does not transform chaos into meaning. This is not an argument for abandoning science in favor of mythology. It is rather a recognition that science and mythology serve different human needs, and the decline of traditional religious belief has left certain needs unaddressed. The Aztecs who worshipped Atlacamani had psychological resources for coping with storms that many modern people lack. Their framework may have been inaccurate in scientific terms, but it was effective in human terms, helping them maintain sanity and community in the face of forces that could not be controlled. These cross-cultural comparisons reveal several important patterns. First, the personification of storms as divine beings is a nearly universal phenomenon. Cultures across the world, separated by vast distances and with no known contact, independently developed storm deities. This suggests that the psychological need to understand and relate to storms in personal terms is deeply rooted in human nature. Second, storm deities tend to be characterized by duality. They are both feared and worshipped, both destructive and potentially beneficial. This duality reflects the reality of storms themselves, which bring the rain that sustains life even as they threaten to take it away. The gods and goddesses who control storms embody this complexity, refusing to be reduced to simple categories of good or evil. Third, storm deities are often connected to the ocean. This makes intuitive sense, since the most devastating storms typically form over warm ocean waters and derive their power from maritime humidity. A deity who controls such storms must therefore have authority over the sea as well as the sky, ruling the interface between water and air where hurricanes are born. Fourth, female storm deities, while less common than male ones, are found in multiple cultures and often have distinctive characteristics. They tend to be associated with feminine power in its fierce, untamed form, representing an aspect of womanhood that refuses domestication or control. Atlacamani, Oya, and Tempestas all embody this archetype of the powerful, dangerous goddess whose authority extends over forces that can reshape the world. The existence of these cross-cultural parallels does not diminish the distinctiveness of Atlacamani. She remained uniquely Aztec, shaped by the specific religious, cultural, and environmental context of Mesoamerica. But recognizing her place within a global pattern of storm worship helps us understand that the Aztecs were participating in a universal human project. The attempt to make sense of the senseless power of nature through mythology, ritual, and prayer. Our journey through the mythology of Atlacamani has taken us from the hurricane-swept shores of ancient Mexico through the cosmic dramas of Aztec creation myths and across the world to similar storm deities in other cultures. Now let us consider what remains of this tradition today and what lessons it might hold for our contemporary understanding of nature, divinity, and the human place in the cosmos. The first and most obvious legacy of Atlacamani and her fellow Mesoamerican storm deities is linguistic. The word hurricane, used by English speakers around the world to describe the most powerful tropical cyclones, derives directly from the indigenous deities of the Caribbean and Gulf region. Every time a meteorologist warns of an approaching hurricane, every time a news anchor describes hurricane damage, every time a survivor tells their story of surviving a hurricane, they are using a word that preserves the memory of Taino and Maya storm gods. This linguistic connection is more than a curiosity. It demonstrates how deeply embedded in human consciousness the personification of storms became. We could easily have adopted a purely technical term for these weather events, and indeed scientists do use terms like tropical cyclone in their professional work. But in everyday speech, we continue to call these storms by the name of a god, implicitly acknowledging the divine power that earlier peoples attributed to them. Beyond language, the mythology of Aztec water deities has influenced Mexican culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The Day of the Dead, one of Mexico's most distinctive cultural celebrations, draws on pre-Columbian beliefs about death and the afterlife, including the concept of Mictlan, the underworld where most souls went after death. While this celebration is primarily associated with death deities rather than water goddesses, it demonstrates the persistence of indigenous religious concepts in contemporary Mexican culture. More directly relevant to our subject, rural communities in Mexico continue to practice rainmaking rituals that echo pre-Columbian worship of Tlaloc and related deities. While these rituals are now typically framed in Catholic terms, invoking saints rather than Aztec gods, their basic structure often preserves indigenous elements. The offerings, the mountain locations, the emphasis on community participation, and the belief that human ritual action can influence divine weather patterns. Tlaloc's influence persists in these ceremonies, and by extension, the broader Aztec understanding of water deities that included Atlacamani. The artistic heritage of Aztec water gods is visible in Mexican muralism and other art forms. The great muralists of the 20th century, including Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and José Clemente Orozco, frequently incorporated pre-Columbian imagery into their monumental public works. While Atlacamani specifically may not appear often, the iconography of Tlaloc, Calcayatlicue, and other water deities has been preserved and celebrated in these works, keeping the visual memory of Aztec religion alive. Popular culture has also discovered Aztec mythology, though often in simplified or distorted forms. Video games, fantasy novels, and comic books have all drawn on Mesoamerican religious traditions, introducing characters based on Aztec gods to global audiences. While these popular culture depictions rarely achieve historical accuracy, they do spark interest in the original myths and sometimes lead people to explore the more authentic traditions from which these characters derive. The scholarly study of Mesoamerican religions has advanced tremendously in recent decades, and we now have better access than ever to knowledge about deities like Atlacamani. Archaeological discoveries continue to expand our understanding of pre-Columbian cultures, while improved translations of indigenous texts provide clearer windows into Aztec religious thought. The famous codices, the pictorial manuscripts that recorded Aztec history and religion, have been digitized and made available online, allowing anyone with internet access to see the original images of water deities and storm gods. At the same time, some contemporary practitioners of various spiritual traditions have sought to revive or reconstruct Aztec religion. These modern practitioners, sometimes called Mexica Reconstructionists, attempt to honor the gods of pre-Columbian Mexico according to traditional practices as best they can be understood. While these movements are relatively small, they represent a serious effort to keep Atlacamani and her divine family alive as objects of genuine worship rather than mere historical curiosities. Beyond these direct legacies, Atlacamani's mythology offers insights that remain relevant to contemporary concerns about nature, climate, and human vulnerability. The Aztecs understood something that modern people sometimes forget: that we are not the masters of nature, but beings who exist at the mercy of forces far greater than ourselves. Hurricanes did not obey human commands in 1500, and they do not obey them today. The most sophisticated weather prediction technology cannot stop a storm, only warn of its approach. Satellite imagery shows us what Atlacamani might be planning, but it does not give us the power to prevent her storms from coming. Climate change is making this lesson more relevant than ever. Scientists warn that warming oceans will produce more intense and possibly more frequent hurricanes in the coming decades. The devastating storms that have struck in recent years, from Katrina to Maria to countless others, may be harbingers of what is to come. As these storms intensify, modern people may find themselves needing psychological resources not so different from those the Aztecs developed. Ways to cope with terrifying natural forces that cannot be controlled, only endured. The Aztec approach of personalizing and sacralizing these forces may seem foreign to modern sensibilities, but it served important functions. By treating hurricanes as expressions of divine will, the Aztecs maintained a sense of meaning and relationship even in the face of disaster. They could pray to Atlacamani, make offerings to her, and feel that they were participating in an ongoing exchange with the forces that shaped their world. Whether or not these prayers were effective in any literal sense, they surely provided psychological comfort and social cohesion that purely secular approaches to disaster cannot easily replicate. Modern people who survive hurricanes sometimes describe religious experiences in the aftermath, a sense of divine presence, a feeling of having been protected or spared, a new appreciation for the fragility of life and the power of nature. These experiences are not so different from what Aztec storm survivors must have felt, and they suggest that the capacity for religious response to natural disaster is built into human psychology rather than being merely a cultural artifact. This is not to suggest that we should return to sacrificing children to storm gods or abandon scientific meteorology in favor of prayer. The point is rather that the Aztec approach to storms contained wisdom that scientific knowledge does not address. Wisdom about how to maintain meaning, community, and sanity in a world where devastating natural forces can strike at any time. As we face an increasingly stormy future, this wisdom may prove valuable. Let us also consider what Atlacamani might represent in a metaphorical or psychological sense, even for those who do not believe in literal divine beings. She is the embodiment of forces beyond control, the personification of the powerful and destructive aspects of existence. Every human life contains such forces: illness, accident, the unpredictable actions of other people, the inevitable approach of death. Atlacamani is a symbol for all of these, a divine face that can be given to the faceless terrors that stalk every human journey. To worship Atlacamani in this symbolic sense would mean accepting the reality of these uncontrollable forces rather than denying or ignoring them. It would mean developing a relationship with uncertainty and danger rather than pretending they do not exist. It would mean finding ways to honor the wildness and unpredictability of existence rather than trying to control everything and becoming bitter when control fails. These are not superstitious attitudes, but mature philosophical stances that many wisdom traditions, religious and secular, have recommended. The story of Atlacamani also reminds us of the environmental dimensions of religious practice. The Aztecs worshipped water deities because water was absolutely essential to their survival, and this worship reinforced attitudes of respect and care toward water resources. They could not exploit the ocean without limit because the ocean belonged to powerful goddesses who demanded reverence. They could not ignore the signs of coming storms because those storms were divine messages requiring human attention. Modern environmental consciousness might benefit from similar attitudes. The idea that nature is sacred, that it has rights and claims that humans must respect, that environmental destruction is a kind of sacrilege. These notions have deep roots in indigenous traditions like Aztec religion. Seeing Atlacamani in a hurricane reminds us that the ocean is not merely a resource to be exploited, but a realm with its own integrity and power, a domain that exists for its own sake and not simply for human benefit. And now we come to the end of our journey. We have traveled from the storm-threatened shores of ancient Mexico through the divine families and cosmic dramas of Aztec mythology, across the world to similar storm traditions in other cultures, and back to consider what these ancient beliefs might mean for us today. Atlacamani remains a figure of power and mystery, a goddess who embodied the terror and majesty of oceanic storms. Her worshippers saw in her the same forces that we see when we watch satellite images of hurricanes spinning across the Gulf of Mexico. The incredible energy, the destructive potential, the beauty that somehow coexists with danger. They developed religious practices to relate to these forces, practices that seem strange to modern eyes, but that served deep human needs for meaning, community, and hope. Today, Atlacamani's storms still rage. The hurricanes that bear names derived from her divine cousins still devastate coastal communities. The ocean she ruled still rises and falls with tides and surges, still provides and still destroys. We may not believe in storm goddesses, but the storms themselves have not changed. They remain as powerful, as terrifying, and as unpredictable as they were when Aztec fishermen first pushed their canoes into waters they knew belonged to forces beyond their comprehension. Perhaps there is something we can learn from those ancient fishermen. They did not pretend the storms were not there. They did not imagine they could control forces so vastly greater than themselves. They developed ways to live with the reality of their situation, maintaining hope and sanity while accepting the fundamental truth that nature is more powerful than humanity and always will be. In an age of climate change and intensifying storms, their example may be more valuable than we would like to admit. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Atlacamani and the rich mythology that surrounded her. If this journey into Aztec storm worship has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to explore further to learn more about the fascinating civilization that created these myths and to reflect on what ancient wisdom might mean for our contemporary world. If you enjoyed this deep dive into mythology, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you do not miss our future explorations of folklore and legend from around the world. Your likes, comments, and shares help us reach more people who share our fascination with the great stories humanity has told about itself and its world. The questions that Atlacamani's mythology addresses remain relevant today. How do we relate to forces beyond our control? How do we find meaning in catastrophe? How do we maintain hope and community when nature reminds us of our fundamental vulnerability? These are not questions that science alone can answer, though science provides essential practical tools for dealing with the physical realities of storms and other natural disasters. The Aztec answer to these questions involved creating personal relationships with natural forces, treating storms as the actions of divine beings who could be understood, addressed, and potentially influenced. This approach had limitations and costs, including the terrible institution of human sacrifice. But it also had strengths that we would do well to appreciate, including its capacity to maintain meaning and community in the face of uncontrollable danger. As we face a future that may include more frequent and more intense hurricanes, we might consider what resources we have for coping with this reality. The scientific resources are clear: better prediction, better building codes, better evacuation procedures, better emergency response. But the psychological and spiritual resources are less obvious. How will we find meaning in catastrophes that climate change may make more common? How will we maintain hope when our carefully built world can be destroyed overnight by forces we cannot stop? These are questions that every culture facing natural disasters has had to answer, and the mythology of storm deities like Atlacamani represents one answer that served human needs for thousands of years. We need not adopt that answer wholesale to learn from it. The core insight, that we need ways to relate to uncontrollable natural forces that maintain our sense of meaning and agency, remains valid even if the specific forms it takes must change with our changing understanding of the world. The story of Atlacamani also reminds us of the richness and sophistication of pre-Columbian American civilizations. The Aztecs were not primitive people with simple beliefs. They were the inheritors of millennia of Mesoamerican cultural development, building on the achievements of the Olmec, the Maya, the Teotihuacanos, the Toltec, and many other peoples. Their religious thought was as complex and internally consistent as any in the world, addressing the full range of human concerns with insight and creativity. When the Spanish arrived and destroyed the Aztec political system, they also attempted to destroy Aztec religion. Temples were torn down, idols were smashed, codices were burned, and priests were killed or forcibly converted to Christianity. Much was lost during this cultural catastrophe, and we will never fully recover the religious knowledge of the pre-Columbian peoples. But enough survived in adapted forms and hidden practices, in archaeological remains and colonial-era documents, that we can still reconstruct something of what the Aztecs believed and why it mattered to them. Atlacamani herself has left relatively few traces in the historical record, perhaps because her worship was centered in coastal areas that were less densely populated than the highland core of the Aztec Empire, perhaps because she was always a somewhat specialized deity rather than one of the major gods. But what we do know suggests a deity who embodied essential truths about the human relationship to nature, truths that remain relevant even as the specific religious forms that express them have faded. The ocean still has its storms. The winds still howl. The waves still rise. And human beings still stand on the shore, watching the horizon darken, wondering what is coming and whether they will survive it. In that moment of primal anxiety, we are not so different from the Aztec fishermen who looked to Atlacamani with fear and hope, praying that the storm goddess would show them mercy. Perhaps, in some sense, we still pray to her, even if we do not know her name. Every wish for safety, every hope for survival, every moment of awe at the terrible beauty of a hurricane. These are the prayers that humans have always offered to the forces that control the storms. Atlacamani heard those prayers 500 years ago. Something, or perhaps nothing, hears them still. But the prayers continue, because we cannot help but reach out to forces greater than ourselves, asking for understanding, asking for mercy, asking for the chance to see another dawn. Until next time, may your journeys be safe, whether on land or sea, and may the storm goddesses of whatever tradition you follow look upon you with favor. This has been the story of Atlacamani, the storm goddess of the Aztecs. Thank you for watching.